Okay, I think we are ready to go. Thank you all for joining us today for today's webinar, President Biden's New Direction for Government Contracting. If you've been paying attention a lot or a little, you know a lot's been happening in a short amount of weeks, so we're going to go over all of that today. Your webinar today is being presented by Olds Morrison, Rinker, and Baker, and we are not only known for our construction law experience, but also our extensive government contracts practice, which is nationally recognized as one of the top government contracts law firms in the US by Legal 500. We work with government contractors, large and small, across a wide variety of industries, including construction, of course, but also base operations, maintenance, defense, maritime, engineering, healthcare, aerospace, information technology, engineering, or energy and communications, just to name a few. Before I introduce our two speakers here, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping topics. Number one, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording on our website at olds.com after the event is complete. Additionally, we will be emailing all of you attendees the slides at the end. Likely that'll come out tomorrow. So please feel free to revisit the content that you hear today and share with your colleagues. I also invite all of you to share your comments and questions. So please take a look at the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you think you have a question for one of the speakers at any point, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and I'll be holding those questions for discussion at the end of the presentation. We've allowed for a large block of time for comments and questions, so just know that if you have anything to ask, we should have enough time to get to everybody. And additionally, I wanted to let everybody know that we are hosting another webinar on March 25th, which will focus on getting paid on government contracts, new developments on REAs and claims. So mark your calendars for March 25th, and you will be receiving an invitation to that probably in the next coming weeks. Okay, today's presenters are Jim Nagel and Howard Roth. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Jim Nagel, the man, the myth, the legend, the famous internationally renowned government contracts expert. He has extensive experience working in the government and with government contractors, and he's the author of 7 books and more than 100 articles on government contracting, including Administration of Government Contracts, which is long considered the book on federal government contracting and found on most desks of government contracting officers as their reference. Jim is a frequent instructor in government contracts, and he's usually flying in normal times, flying all over the world, instructing on government contracts. So it's nice to have him here local more often than not these days, and we're always honored to have Jim as part of the Olds Morrison family. And then we have Howard Roth. He is our chair of the Olds Morrison Government Contracts Practice Group. He has over 3 decades of experience handling federal procurement matters, and companies particularly seek out Howard for his counsel on navigating complex contract disputes act claims and appeals, and with issues unique to maritime and aerospace contracts or contractors. Howard also served as the commissioner of the ASBCA and the deputy general counsel at the Army Support Command in California. And Howard served as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Judge Advocate Corps and was a trial team chief at the Army Contract Appeals Division, litigating GAO bid protests and contracts appeals. Never fear that government contracts will give you a tongue twister. So at this time, I'm going to hand the floor over to Jim Nagel, who is going to start the presentation today. Jim, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Annette. That was a heck of an introduction. I'm going to disappoint all of you guys after that introduction. I don't see any of you, but I looked at the list, and my gosh, some of you I've known for decades and decades. But let's go right in and get started. First slide, please, Annette. To those of you who have been through this before, getting a whole bunch of changes when there's a new president, especially of a different party, there's nothing new about that. What's new here is the record number that we're getting so quickly. Howard and I were changing slides up till an hour ago because every day there seems to be a new executive order or executive memorandum. A lot of that is driven by the pandemic, obviously, and the attempted recovery from that. We've tried to group the presentation into two things. There will be two major categories of changes that are happening and will happening. First, more money and more projects. Be assured the federal government is not going to retreat one dime from the spending it has been experiencing. In FY 2019, the last year we have full data on, the government spent $586 billion in contracting. That will be exploded very quickly when you see the types of numbers we're talking about. And that's essential to help the economy get back to where it was. So there we're just talking about more money and new types of projects. But there's going to be changes in the rules and the regulations. Now, if you're not a government prime contractor, you're a subcontractor, or you're someone who does not contract with the federal government, but you contract on projects that are funded with federal dollars, don't think, well, I don't have to worry about all that. Well, yeah, you do. A lot of these things are going to flow down via grants. So if the federal Transportation Department gives a grant to the Oklahoma Department of Transportation, there'll be a lot of strings attached to that, as there always are. And a lot of these things will flow down via flow down clauses. So even though you may not have a direct contract with the federal government, you are not going to be immune to the things we're going to be talking about. Now, most of the changes in the regulations will appear in the socioeconomic area, parts 19 of the FAR through 25. But then there's an awful lot of changes on cybersecurity that Howard is going to talk about extensively. Next slide, please, Annette. Now, in terms of the money that is going to be spent, infrastructure, President Biden is going to be submitting an infrastructure proposal that is promised to include trillions of dollars in new spending. Just when some of us were getting used to the idea of trillion-dollar budgets, now we're seeing trillions of dollars in new spending, not salaries, not retirement pay, but in new dollar amounts for infrastructure. This is not your parents' idea of infrastructure. When I first started, infrastructure meant roads and bridges. Now it means pretty much everything. Waterfronts, airfields, flood control, clean drinking and clean water, very, very important. We'll talk about that. This is going to be a very green administration. Broadband, if it affects the grid, it's categorized under infrastructure. One thing it will not include is the border wall. President Trump's border wall has already been stopped, quote, to the extent permitted by law, close quote. Apparently, the administration recognizes that those contracts have been awarded. You can terminate them for convenience if you want, but sometimes you just can't stop something on a dime. It'll go forward a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, it is dead. Okay? Clean energy, as I said, that's coming, and I'm going to come back to that. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, Howard will take this one.
Well, this is where the rubber meets the road. There are all these plans, but show me the money. And on February 5th, the Senate and the House advanced the first priority that President Biden's administration has, and that is the very important American Rescue Plan. Now, when we talk about money, and Jim was mentioning $500 billion in government contract spending in 2019, this plan that was passed by the House and the Senate comes in at 1.9 trillion with a T. And so this is historic by any means. If you remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009, during that Great Recession, that was 800 million. So just the American Rescue Plan is more than twice the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Now, the actual American Rescue Plan, it's targeting COVID-19 issues dealing with the recession, but it also includes funds that are going to be spent, on construction. 130 billion of the 1.9 trillion, K to 12 school expenditures, and some of that is going to deal with changes to classrooms and ventilation. I mean, smaller projects, but still a lot of money on the table. 350 billion in emergency assistance to state and local governments. Again, some of that money is also going to go into construction. But the real huge historic, we're talking Cold War, World War II plan, is the Build Back Better plan. And President Biden has fleshed this out in speeches and policy papers, and it's going to be detailed in the State of the Union address. Again, when we talk about the money, over 4 years, it's $7 trillion. And when we talk about infrastructure, 1.3 trillion. And as Jim said, it's for, everything that you can imagine. Some things that, 10 years ago were hard to imagine. Broadband throughout the country and in rural areas, and areas where there just isn't the access that's needed. Green vehicles, as they say, electric vehicles, rail, 1.7 or 1.3 trillion. And this year, just to get things jump started, just for highways and bridges, the amount is 50 billion. Now, again, this is where the rubber meets the road. Well, Howard, is this really going to happen? And all I can say is the 1.9 trillion, that happened. It's been passed by the House and the Senate. But then you might say, well, Howard, I mean, isn't there, a filibuster, the 60 votes? And yes, it's, that is a true fact that there is a filibuster, but through the reconciliation process, the administration does have a way around that for much of the money, although of course it's much more preferable to have bipartisan support. When you look at funds earmarked for small businesses, in the 1.9 trillion, you've got 15 billion with a B. I mean, it's almost like we use billions the way we used to use millions. 15 billion in grants to small businesses, and then 35 billion in financing that would be leveraged to 175 billion dollars in lending. Again, the American Rescue Plan is aimed at reviving all these small businesses that we all know and loved previously when we were going into the office, had been devastated by the pandemic, or when we were traveling and when we were staying in hotels, and just the whole ripple effect. And so, next slide, please. What we have is something, that's historic. Now, in the area of government contracts, part of this is 300 billion in proposed investment in research and development. Now, this comes under the rubric of the Build Back America plan. And part of it for R&D is the Innovate in America. And what we're talking about are advanced industries, cutting edge telecommunications, artificial intelligence, clean vehicles. And, again, they're channeling the Apollo program, and what President Biden said is on a scale well beyond the Apollo program. And certainly the numbers that are being proposed and being passed, when you look at the at this first initiative, the American Rescue Plan, or American Rescue Plan, it certainly is historic. Why are we doing this? Well, you can say it was long overdue, but it's also, life is, about competition, and China, by the Biden administration's estimates, some estimates, has overtaken the U.S. in research and development spending. As you see with the, Section 889 of the NDA, which I'll briefly discuss later, dealing with Chinese telecommunications, we certainly are in competition with China. And this past year, 2020, while they were, essentially coming neck and neck with us, we spent 0.7% of GDP on research and development. And, back in 1964, when, NASA was getting going on many of their projects leading to the moon landing, we were spending 2% of our GDP on research and development. And basically, that's a difference in today's dollars of 250 billion less annually that we are spending. So we're talking about money, and where is this capital going to come from? Well, of course, it's going to come from the government, but how are they going to get that money out? And one of the existing programs that the Biden administration says they're going to scale up and sort of supersize is the Small Business Innovation and Research / STTR program. A lot of growth there. What does this mean for folks who aren't in government contracts or are new to government contracts? I think you've got to remember that you've got rights and technical data and computer software, intellectual property. And the Biden team has been seeking, broader intellectual property rights in solicitations. They've been talking about that. Certainly the Trump administration, especially with DOD, was doing that. So you have to be very aware of how to protect your valuable intellectual property. Certainly we need to look at the proposed DFARS provisions, and they're designed to shift the IP rights from these current standards that you can read and understand, as confusing as they can sometimes be, to more individualized ownership and license rights. And what the government would like is that, and it clearly says it in the proposed DFARS revisions, they'd like to make it more favorable to the government and less favorable to the contractor. So the point is, all this money is coming in, and it's the big game in town, but you've got to realize that it's different than the commercial space. You've got to protect your IP, and then of course the different rules under the FAR and the DFAR. So I guess to sum up this, Build Back America, the amount of money that we're talking about, I mean, forget the fact that President Biden is changing many rules with government contracts. There are other areas where President Biden is going to be building on the Trump administration, especially as we will just discuss with the Buy American domestic content provisions. So beyond Apollo. So I think that's the exciting thing for government contracts. We're going to have even more government contracts coming our way than the 500 billion plus that we did last year. Next slide.
Okay, I'll jump in and take this one. This is one thing that President Biden cannot do by executive order. He cannot appropriate the money by an executive order. That takes Congress, and there he could run into a roadblock. there are thin Democratic majorities in both houses. The amounts that he's talking about are huge, obviously, at a time when tax revenues are going to be down. And already fiscally conservative members of Congress, not just Republicans, are saying, well, wait a minute, do we have the money for that? So while the first one or two of these acts have gone through, don't be assured that these huge sums will be voted by Congress automatically. Now, regardless of whether those huge sums, they're going to be large increases, and along with that, there will be changes in particular government contracts. Now, next slide, Annette. Now, some Trump policies will continue. Okay? You know, a lot of President Trump's policies worked out very, very well, and they'll be continued, perhaps with new emphases. Sometimes there will be a U-turn. I'll talk about those in a few moments, where boom, they've already been reversed. There has been, as you all know, an incredibly aggressive use, a record, unprecedented use of executive orders already. Over 30 executive orders have been issued by President Biden, in addition to 22 executive memorandums. So they've been substantial. Now, some of the re-emphasized and initiatives that are listed there in the bottom of your slide, we're going to talk about though in more detail. We've talked a little bit about infrastructure projects. In that last line, I say DPA. That is the Defense Production Act. I'm going to talk about that on the next one or two slides. And then you have A76. Now, some of you old hands may remember this was a policy that it established under President Eisenhower. Basically, a government workforce, an existing workforce that had been doing the job for decades, had to compete against contractors, and the government workforce would put in a bid to see if they were the best value. People, A76 for the Biden administration is as dead as a doornail. Okay, it's not gonna happen. As you all know, and I'll repeat later on, Democratic administrations historically are very much pro-union. The American Federation of Government Employees, AFGE, was one of his biggest supporters. So there's simply no way that the Biden administration is going to be having a potential loss of government employee jobs by losing to contractors. President Biden has already issued directives that the Justice Department is to end, not renew, not continue any contracts for private prisons. So that's gone. That is just the first wave, I think. So A76 gone for this administration. Next slide, please. Some of the things of President Trump that are also likely to stay. His replacement for NAFTA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, that looks like it's going to stay. There was going to be a lot of there was a lot of bipartisan support for that. That should continue. Opportunity zones that was created by President Trump's Tax Cut Act in 2017, that is likely to continue. That has been praised by both sides as playing a leading role in keeping unemployment so low among minorities in the intercity because of favorable tax treatments. The Defense Production Act. If you're familiar with the Defense Production Act, it was enacted in 1950 with the Korean War. It allows the government to be a traffic cop. So basically, if Alan gets a contract and it is a highly rated contract, Alan, we need this. The government basically says to Alan, the contractor, you must work on this government contract before any other contract, before any even other government contracts, and even before your long-term customers. And we will indemnify you if people try to sue you on that. We will give you immunity from that. And Joe Burks, you're going to be selling steel. You must sell it first to Alan. Okay? So it allows the government to act like a traffic cop. President Trump has used that act at least 18 times, especially in the development of the coronavirus vaccine. President Biden has already used it to speed up the production and distribution of the vaccine, and also to speed up the production of protective gear, such as the N95 equipment. I noticed one person asked about the BRAC, the reduction in installations and things like that. I have not seen any indications that that's going to change. If you remember, BRAC was because of a bipartisan committee. So I think that is less likely to be affected, okay? But I haven't seen anything definite on that one way or the other. Next slide, please, Annette. Now, the likely return of Obama executive orders. President Trump had kept some of President Obama's executive orders. His executive order on paying a minimum wage and on sick leave. Those were not revoked. They are still implemented. They are still in the FAR. Others were revoked. The first one I have there, the right of first refusal for service employees. This had started with President Clinton. It was revoked by President Bush. It returned under President Obama, and it then was revoked by President Trump. It will in all likelihood come back. And it works this way. If Mary Jo was the incumbent contractor, there's a reprocurement. Genevieve wins the new contract, new service contract. Before Genevieve can hire replacement workers, she must go to Mary Jo's employees and make the offer to them first, okay? It was a right of first refusal. It was only applied to service employees under service contracts. We don't know if it'll be expanded, but in all likelihood, it's coming back. Then that Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Act. This was an executive order of President Obama. It never went into full effect. A federal judge in Texas enjoined it the day before it was to fully take effect. And then Congress and President Trump totally revoked it. It did three things. First, on transparency on pay. It required federal contractors, when you pay your employees, there was to be essentially an expanded pay stub, including the rate of pay, the amount of hours worked, overtime, gross pay, what deductions were taken, and whether the individual being paid was an employee or an independent contractor. I'm going to come back to that later on, another slide. Second problem, I shouldn't say problem, well, it was a problem for the federal judge on accountability. President Obama basically said, why should we continue to award contracts to contractors who are continually violating labor laws, sexual harassment, things like that? The problem was the executive order did not merely require contractors, when they propose on a contract, from listing all the times they have been found liable for that. But they had to include any times they were alleged to have done this, even though it had never reached a final resolution by a court, a board, an arbitration panel, what have you. The federal judge thought that was violative of due process, so that's why he enjoined it. It's gone now. Third thing the executive order did, many employers, when they hire a new employee, in the employment contract, the employee must agree that if they have a sexual harassment complaint, they must handle it through an arbitration panel rather than going to court. Now, a lot of employees were saying, well, wait a minute, you are asking us to give up our right to a jury. Employers would respond, but why do we want to flood courts with all of these? And courts take so long, it lingers, attorney's fees go up. Let's just do it by arbitration. So the executive order banned that. That was overturned. In all likelihood, that executive order will come back. Now, they might dot some I's and cross their T's, but in all likelihood, it will come back. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, Howard had talked a little bit about small business. He's already talked about $400 billion, a huge amount. Not too long ago, that would have been the entire amount the federal government spent on oil contracting. That's earmarked for small business. But take a look at that second bullet. The administration goal is to triple how much the federal government's goal is for awards to small disadvantaged business. It's 5% now. They want to triple that to 15% by 2025. So the Biden administration plans to give small businesses, and especially small disadvantaged business, an even bigger slice of an even bigger pie. So be aware of that. So those of you who are large businesses, be prepared to beef up your small business subcontracting plans to make sure that you don't have a disconnect with the administration goals. Now, the Biden administration has said that they will have more audits to verify, are you really a small business? Are you really a hub zone small business? Are you really small and disadvantaged? Are you woman-owned? But there's going to be personnel restraints there as to how many investigators the government can have to do that. But be aware, that's the promise. Now, the last bullet, the Biden administration has promised they will have more restraints on the federal government use of bundled contracts. Now, if you're not familiar with bundled contracts, they work this way. Traditional rule, military installation, VA complex, what have you, the government would award a small business contract to janitorial services, another one for lawn mowing, another one for trash disposal, another one for window washing, things like that. So that would be 10 or 15 different small business contracts that they had to award and administer. So the government decided, no, we'll bundle them all together into one large contract. It may be too big for any one small business, so it'll be a large business contract now. Small business community didn't like that, so they put some restraints in the FAR that are in 7.107-3, as noted on the slide. You cannot do it, federal government, unless there are objective, measurable savings from doing that. The Biden administration has promised that they will increase the number of restraints, so bundled contracts will be reduced in the future. Next slide, please. Labor standards, Part 22. Part 22 on labor will undoubtedly be one of the ones most seriously changed under a Biden administration. President Trump had issued an executive order combating race and sex stereotyping. It prohibited federal contractors from using workplace diversity and inclusion training to promote race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating. To be blunt, it was basically, you can't just blame white people, view white people as the enemy or so. There was never any doubt that in a Biden administration, this was dead man walking. It was revoked, not merely within days of the Biden administration taking office, but within hours. It is gone now. It is stopped. President Biden has also issued an executive order, and I title it there, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So the LGBTQ community is protected by this new executive order. You cannot discriminate against a contractor or an employee on the basis of gender identification or sexual orientation. Now, to enforce this and all other existing laws, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP, is going to be more active than ever before to making sure that contractors live up to the employment standards and the equal employment opportunities. You will have more audits and more thorough audits. Now, I need to mention one thing in particular. President Biden has proposed Jenny Yang as the head of OFCCP. Her focus, to a great extent, has been pay equity. Are minorities being paid the same? Are women being paid the same? Remember, I mentioned on an earlier slide that there's likely a return of that enhanced pay information. That will be used by OFCCP to identify, is there a discrepancy in how people are being paid? So if you are a contractor, make sure you are prepared to explain, well, yes, that white man is being paid more because of seniority or something like that. Now, the next bullet, minimum wage. President Trump had kept President Obama's executive order, but that executive order right now, as of January 1st, the minimum wage for federal contractors is $10.95. President Biden has promised that within 100 days of his administration taking office, he will issue an executive order raising that for federal contractors to $15. Now, don't be confused. You may have seen news articles that President Biden was delaying and putting into a separate statute the $15 minimum wage. That was for the entire country. Okay? That has to go to Congress. As far as I can see, he is still promising that minimum wage executive order for federal contractors within 100 days. Now, there's one wrinkle on that. You may have seen the Congressional Budget Office came out with a study a couple of days ago that said if you enact that nationwide increase, true, it would raise 900,000 people out of poverty. However, 1.4 million jobs would be lost, and it would be inflationary. So I don't know if the Biden administration is having second thoughts about the proposed executive order. They certainly have not announced it publicly. Project labor agreements will increase. Okay? As I'll say on the next slide, any Democratic administration is much more pro-union than any Republican administration. Project labor agreements are covered under Part 22.5 of the FAR. They are pre-hire agreements that the federal agency enters into with a local labor organization, a union, to establish the terms and conditions of any employment for a particular federal construction project. So they're coming. Next slide, please, Annette. As I mentioned, that's the way it breaks out. Democratic administration's much more pro-union. Patty Murray, Democratic Senator of Washington, has proposed the PRO Act to protect the right to organize, nationwide act. If it passes, probably the most pro-union, really strengthening the ability of people to organize and to become union members. Now, that last bullet there, it focuses on construction, but it's not limited to construction. The Biden administration will make it easier for workers who are not U.S. citizens to be legally employed, not just in construction, services especially. The reason for that is the betting now under the Trump administration, the DACA program and the TPS, they were living on borrowed time. If they were not going to be eliminated, they were going to be cut back. Under a Biden administration, they are not going to be cut back. They will probably be strengthened. So it will be easier for employers to hire workers who are not U.S. citizens. Okay. Next slide, please. Now, Part 23, which is a laundry list: environment, energy, safety. The Biden administration undoubtedly is going to be more environmentally sensitive and aggressive. Let me focus on the word aggressive for a moment. Clean energy, clean water, renewable energy, those are going to be watchwords for the next 4 years. Howard mentioned that the administration has promised that federal gas-driven vehicles will be phased out. There's something like 645,000 of them. They will be phased out, and it's got to be a phase. There's just too many vehicles just to have a yard sale to get rid of them all. So it's not going to happen next week, but it is coming. You've already seen that the Keystone pipeline has been stopped. Now, that next bullet, please pay attention to this. This was tepidly announced in the Obama administration. It's coming back strong under the Biden administration. It doesn't matter how well you economically, ecologically, environmentally perform this government contract that you're bidding on. What is your carbon footprint? Okay. So basically, it looks like in the future, when you propose on a government contract, you will not be proposing only your technical plan, your management plan, your past performance, your cost. You will also have to submit, this is our carbon footprint. This is how we are a good steward of the economy. Totally aside from what we will do to perform this contract if we're lucky enough to get it. But this is to show you that we are a good company. So be aware of that. That's coming. And that final bullet on that page, fairly recent. If you are a federal contractor, you're working in a federal building or on federal land. So if you're working in a national forest and the closest federal building is 30 miles away, it doesn't matter. If you're on federal land, the agency heads must assure you comply with the Center for Disease Control guidelines on masking and keeping socially distant. Last slide, please. My last slide. Howard will have others. Buy American Act. Okay. Howard will go into the details on this more, but President Trump had been extremely active. He had been the most active president on Buy American Act since Eisenhower. He issued 3 executive orders. The last one will be implemented in the FAR via a final rule very, very shortly, just another week or so. President Biden has already signaled that he's going to continue that. He has already issued his own executive order, which I list there. It will be harder to get waivers from the Buy America Act. As Howard and I well recognize, until the Trump administration, it was relatively easy to get waivers. Oh, sure, yeah, here's a waiver for that. Much more difficult now. It has to go much higher than it ever did before. You're not talking about the contracting officer or the chief of the contracting office anymore. You're going much higher. And also, the Biden administration is going to continue the website started by the Trump administration. There will be a publicly available website. Okay, we are considering granting to Chip Retson this waiver because no one in the United States makes this type of product or so, and it's going to be publicly available. So a producer in Schenectady, New York can say, wait a minute, I make that. I make it at a good price and at the requisite quality. So it will be much higher to do that. Now, before I go to that next bullet, the reason why President Trump and President Biden have been doing this, you all remember from your history books, what won World War II was America's arsenal of democracy. We could not replicate that today. There's really no serious debate on that. We've let many of our industries wither on the vine. So both administrations are adamant about increasing that. What President Trump did in one of his executive orders, you may remember that old rule. If you had 50.1% of an item, of a component that was made domestically, domestic in origin, it was a domestic component. That has been raised. It is now 95% for iron and steel. Very high, obviously, because those industries have been decimated over the last 20 or 30 years. And 55% for other items, okay, non-commercial off-the-shelf items. But everything else, 55%, but it is also likely that that will increase. Okay, so big push there that Howard will talk about a little bit more. Next slide, Annette.
Well, Jim, I think here we're segueing over to Made in All of America, the new executive order. And I think the way to think about this, and Jim has hit on it, is that President Biden is essentially building upon and continuing what the Trump administration did. There's no big change here, other than there's likely to be more enforcement, and President Biden is pushing some areas, like I'll mention the Jones Act that that President Trump was not as active in. So, what are some of these changes in the new executive order? Well, there's a lot of changes, but one of them, I think, probably the most important under FAR Part 25 is how domestic content is measured. And the executive order replaces the component test currently in the FAR Part 25, which is used to identify domestic content. And it replaces that with a test that measures the domestic content by the value added. So you're looking at value added to the product through US-based production, or what they call US job supporting economic activity, which, I'm not really sure what that means. That's something that the final rule, that's why the final rule is going to be very important, in answering some of these questions. It took about 1.5 years for Trump's executive order to become a final rule, and we'll see how quickly this EO moves through. The increases to
Okay, something has happened, Howard. I can't hear you. I saw up in the screen somebody had reduced that Annette.
Hi, Jim.
Okay.
I can hear Howard.
I'm sorry, Howard. Yeah, apparently Gloria said they can hear you. So go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me. Thank you, Jim. But so the final rule, which, as Jim mentioned, is going to go into effect, soon here in February, increased to 20% for small business and 30% for large. The percentage added to a foreign bid to determine whether a domestic bid is reasonable. Well, the President Biden executive order, plans to look at that again. And when you consider the fact that DOD's rule is at 50%, I think that there will be pressure to increase it beyond the 20 and 30%. I know we'd had a question earlier specifically about the DFARS and the 50% preference. Yes, the Department of Defense does have a higher preference. What are the practical problems here? And I think that the Trump administration encountered this, and it's the Biden administration is going to encounter this. It's a fact of life. Cost and the lack of an adequate domestic supply chain. And Jim hit on the fact that we're not that same arsenal of democracy that we were. I think Connecticut has that as their motto, because they in the Revolutionary War produced the first guns and continue to this day to do it, and have Sikorsky and whatnot, and an electric boat. We still have quite a capability, but we don't have the same domestic supply chain. An example to our friends, in Alaska, is they have the Alaska Marine Highway System, and they have very large ferries. One is the MV merchant vessel Twistamina. It's a deep sea vessel with actual, berthing spaces, like on a cruise ship. But it's over 45 years old, and they need to to replace it. And so, of course, there are federal funds flowing from the Federal Highway Administration, the same type of funds that that are under the new Biden plan, except supersized. And initially, the state of Alaska asked for over 900 waivers, and all the waiver requests were denied. And lo and behold, they went back and they were able to find hundreds of folks in the domestic supply chain And so they came back with like less than 100 waiver requests. But the cost of having all those domestic suppliers was such that it's adversely impacted the project. So it goes back to this, we have proposed a tremendous amount of money to be spent, 1.9 billion, 7 billion, 300 billion, trillions and billions. And as Jim pointed out, it's not clear that when the rubber meets the road that we're going to have that money. So it's a practical problem. How do you overcome this? Well, we need answers, and the executive order from President Biden does have one suggested answer that's going to be required, and that is the agencies are going to be required to work with Hollings Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which goes and looks for U.S. companies in the domestic supply chain that can meet the government's needs. And so the agencies are going to affirmatively go out and work with this entity to find domestic sources. And again, the final rule would flesh this out, but I'm sure that there'd have to be some type of database or interconnection with the companies so that, to make this useful in putting together, bids and whatnot. Another thing with the order is we're going to have a Made in America office within OMB. And of course, if you're going to have a Made in America office, you've got to have, a Made in America czar, which will be known as the Made in America director. And what this is going to do is, as Jim pointed out in the EO, waivers are going to be harder to come by. And what this czar of Made in America is going to have the ability to do is the agencies are going to have to come up to that person and get approval of waivers. Anytime you have to ask for something at a high level, you have a higher chance of the answer being no. The other thing is agency reporting requirements. I mean, this isn't new. Agencies are going to have to report back within 180 days as to how they're going to be, implementing some of the major, areas that are hit on by this EO. They're not in the final rule yet, but, answering the questions, but then also how they're complying with what the rules are now. And again, this isn't new, except it's going to be required not only 180 days from the order, but biannually. It's going to be a much more, you're on the calendar of the meetings within agencies. Okay, we got to report again. We got to report again. All of this is likely to increase, the fraud risk and enforcement that you will see under the False Claims Act by the Justice Department. I know there was a question. There was a question from the audience dealing with the Department of Defense, and the question basically went to, how is this going to affect qualifying countries? Well, this executive order, of course, affects FAR Part 25, which is not the DoD FAR provision. And the DoD FAR provision does have the whole, idea of qualifying countries. So I would think that this executive order is going to have an impact. The impact is going to be those qualifying countries are treated as if they were domestic content. So to the extent that there is, changes to the component test, or even now with the final rule, changes to the percentage of steel, then you're going to have to look at how that fits into your foreign supply chain and how they, how that rule is now met, and because you won't be dealing with the old rule. I have another question here. that I'm reading on concerning the Buy America Act. With respect to the Buy American, do you believe the World Trade Organization and other trade act exemptions will be restricted, or do you foresee materials from those countries remaining eligible for treatment as domestic? I don't see a change in treaties, and this makes an important point, which is that under the FAR Part 25 for civilian agencies in particular, at certain dollar thresholds, the Buy American Act is going to fall away, and you're going to deal with the Trade Agreements Act. So I don't see the Trade Agreements Act being those agreements being renegotiated. And another thing, though, that, and I mentioned the Jones Act. President Biden in the EO specifically came out, and it's in the EO, supporting and saying the importance of the Jones Act and the continued use of the U.S. flag vessel preference for the movement of goods between U.S. ports. He also has come out very strongly with for the preferences for the use of U.S. bottoms in transporting, U.S. grain and other materials on U.S. bottoms. But one of the interesting things is this also dovetails into green energy, because offshore wind vessels are now being built in the United States in support of these clean energy wind farms that we have off the coast of America. And this, to the extent there was going to be any question, these vessels are being built, which is key for U.S. Shipyards, but also for the U.S. merchant marine, because they'll be crewed with U.S. merchant mariners. So, even when it comes to something as storied and, I guess, old as the Jones Act, green energy is coming and having an impact here for the maritime industry. Let me just see if there are any more questions on. I think I've answered the questions. If not, we can do that at the end. Next slide. So cybersecurity and supply chain security. Really, these are hot button issues now for a number of years, and the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program from the Department of Defense, it went into effect November 30th, 2020, when you're looking to full rollout by 2025. But, that there are steps right now that contractors and subcontractors need to be taking if you deal with any or handle CUI, and you got to register and report your assessment scores. There's an assessment methodology, and you've got to report that in the supplier performance risk system database. So pretty much a continuation of cybersecurity. It's a hot issue, and it's ramping up, more and more as we go forward. And I know another thing that really CMMC wouldn't have had any impact on, but still has now sent, sort of shockwaves through cybersecurity, is the solar winds impact. And I think everybody, has heard about the hacking of the Solar Winds Orion product, and that was a product that many government agencies and industry use. And we talked about competition from China in research and development. We have to always consider our friends, the Russians, And, you know, the US government has said that that SolarWinds hack, I mean, they put it in writing on, you know, FBI letterhead, was done by the Russians. And so what happened was the Russians had inserted a worm into the upgrades, the patches that SolarWinds would put into the Orion product that, you know, all these government agencies were using, such that they had a backdoor look into their IT systems. So extremely serious. So you're going to see a more rigorous than we've already had scrutiny of the supply chain, you know, and a closer examination of software and cloud-based offerings that are sold to the government. The supply chain is, you know, security. Again, another, in addition to what we had on CMMC, is continuing. The Section 889 restrictions on covered technology from Chinese companies won't be stopped. You know, it's going to continue. You know, I mentioned the importance of final rules, and, you know, with the new Made in America and answering outstanding questions. Well, you know, in the Section 889, you know, we have had, you know, FAR provisions that have fleshed out some of the issues, but we're still waiting on a final rule and implementation that will answer some of the lingering questions. You know, for instance, what is a covered company? You know, the covered technology that you're not supposed to use. There's a list of 5 Chinese companies, but then it talks about all its subsidiaries and affiliates. You know, and when a company's supposed to do a reasonable census of its covered technology, you know, it's hopefully the final rule is going to sort of flesh out, you know, what subsidiaries and affiliates means. You know, another open issue is, you know, what constitutes a use. You know, right now it's extremely broad, and you know, it can be a use for areas that are not, you know, covered by by any government contract, all the way up into the C-suite. We also, there, you know, questions as basic as what is telecommunications, video surveillance equipment. You know, if you're telling folks they have to rip out all their Chinese, you know, surveillance equipment, there are a lot of small companies that have, you know, surveillance equipment, and the question there really goes to, you know, where does it fit? Is it really under the type of equipment that's for, you know, public security or surveillance systems such that it's critical infrastructure? And so the final rule should go to answer those outstanding questions. And then you also, considering the SolarWinds, I think it highlights the importance of the new federal, you know, Acquisition Security Council, because what they've got the rows to do, and the power to do, is to essentially identify other technologies, other parts of the supply chain that you're no longer going to be able to use, and they're going to, you know, under their rules now, you know, you go to those companies and tell them, you know, we're looking to exclude this product. Agencies won't be able to purchase it. So a lot of exciting things are happening. You know, we're waiting for final rules. I mean, what Jim and I have been talking about in many ways, you know, we're just looking at tea leaves, but there certainly is a lot of factual basis, and a lot that's been written, and you know, what the rubber's meeting the road now with what we're seeing with the with the initiatives, 7 trillion over 4 years. That's a lot of spending if it actually comes to fruition. Jim, I guess we're to the questions period now. I'll hand it over to you for a moment.
No, I'll hand it over to Annette, see if there's any way she particularly wants us to handle the questions.
Yeah, I know Howard was answering a few questions. I believe he answered Rod's question about the qualifying country exception, and then I think he also answered David's. We have Dan here that has raised his hand. He did ask, what about the AARA? Can Italy, Finland, etc. still be used in our calculations? And I can also call on him to speak if he has. I'm going to allow him to speak if he'd like to. But I'm not sure. Do you guys have an answer to that question?
Well, the executive orders, as Howard said, do not have the authority to overrule statutes. A lot of the agreements under FAR Part 25 and the DFAR's implementation of 225 are based on memorandums of understanding. There was nothing that I saw in the executive order, the new executive order, that would indicate that President Biden was automatically throwing all of those out. I think everything will be reevaluated in light of the executive order, as Howard said. But I don't think that, well, if you were a qualified country prior to January 20th, you're no longer a qualified country. No, I don't think any of that has happened yet.
That was my question. I appreciate you answering it.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Great. All right. And then I want to make sure that we did see from Daniel which type of companies conduct carbon emission calculations or footprints for businesses?
Personally, I don't know the name of any such company. However, that seems to have been a rather growing business in the last few years, and it will certainly grow now. There were some that came out during the Obama administration. Once the Biden administration announces this, and I don't think it will be something that will be announced, okay, we come out with this rule today, it's going to be effective tomorrow. I would imagine there would be 30, 60, or longer period. President Obama, for example, on one of his executive orders, that fair pay and safe workplaces, that was going to be implemented over a 2-year period. So I don't think it's something that will be put in place and effective absolutely immediately. Long-winded answer to your question, but I don't know the name of any company that does that. They are out there, however.
Okay, and then another question here from Gloria. I'm not sure if it was answered, Howard, while you were speaking, or if this goes to Howard, but it's in the chat function. She says, can you tell me if the simplified acquisition threshold increase in GSA SPE memo, SPE 2020-07 from $250,000, government contracts, okay, $250,000 to $750,000 for CONUS and $1.5 million for OCONUS contracts had been extended past December 31st, 2020. I hope I read that correctly.
Jim, I don't know the answer. I can certainly get back. Gloria, if we get your email, we can give you the answer. Jim,
Yeah, I don't specifically know the answer. For those of you like Annette who don't do government conduct, that's CONUS, Continental United States, and owned CONUS is outside the United States, overseas contracting. The federal government had just raised those thresholds within the last year or so, but that was a special one in GSA. I do not know of anything that has specifically extended it. I don't know of any reason why it wouldn't have been extended, but I do not know if it has been extended. But as Howard said, we can get back to you. Okay.
Yeah, I have our email, so we'll definitely be in touch, Gloria. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. What Gloria said is a good point. I should mention there is a simplified acquisition threshold, which is defined in Part 2 of the FAR for normal circumstances, but then they have some exceptions to prevent or recover from chemical, radiological, nuclear, biological attack, or to support a contingency operation or an emergency. What Gloria is referencing, I can see it now, this was a result of the emergency declaration, okay? So it is an exception. And since the emergency is still upon us, I don't know of any reason why it would not have been extended, but I just have not seen that. So Gloria, I hope that is a satisfactory answer right now, and we'll try to get back to you with more detailed information.
Great. Okay, we have about 2 minutes left, so I just want to encourage everyone to reach out to us. You have my email, Howard and Jim's email is on the slide that you are viewing right now, so feel free to shoot us a message or a question, and we're happy to answer those. And lastly, I just want to remind you that we will be having another webinar on Thursday, March 25th on getting paid on government contracts, new developments on REAs and claims. So mark your calendars. And I just want to thank Jim and Howard for your time and for the presentation. And thank you all for joining us. So have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.